All right, can everyone see my screen? Awesome. So hello, everyone. I'm Vivian. Thank you, Keshin, for introducing and inviting Sarah and I to be here today. We're really excited to share our report with you all. If you haven't read the report, that's okay. We're going to quickly recap some of our research and then focus on our early models and design process. So we're from DesignMap, which is a small design agency based in San Francisco. And at DesignMap, we design digital products and user experiences and specialize in enterprise software. Sarah and I are usually allocated to different projects, but in the wake of COVID, we had some time free up and we started applying our design skills to this topic, and that's how this report came about. We published a contact tracing report about a month ago on May 11th. It's currently published on our blog at designmap.com/ideas. This report was put together in 1 week, shortly after our contact tracing related client project. It was an interesting challenge since the news around contact tracing technologies was changing on a daily basis. So we wanted to share our learnings as soon as possible. It was intended to jumpstart the conversation around practical design solutions as well as service design. We thought this report would be the most helpful to leaders in design, tech, business, healthcare, and government to find a way forward. So before we get going, we wanted to make sure everyone understands what contact tracing means. Contact tracing is the process of identifying the people who came into contact with an infected individual. There are two types. There's manual, traditional contact tracing, and there's digital. Digital contact tracing is a digital application, usually a mobile app, that informs users if and when they were in proximity with a device linked to a user that has recently tested positive for the virus. Digital contact tracing is what we're focused on in the report and in this presentation as well. The reason being is we believe that digital contact tracing has the potential to impact a significant change in the transmission curve given the right conditions. Contact tracing is also a critical component to effectively curbing infection spread for COVID-19, SARS, smallpox, and Ebola, and we'll show you how it works. So there are three kinds of people. The first kind in the gray is a healthy individual with no infection. The second in the pink are infected and contagious individuals with no symptoms, also called asymptomatic individuals. And the third in the dark red are infected and contagious individuals with no symptoms. If nothing is done, here is what happens to a neighborhood with patient 0, who is an infected individual not displaying any symptoms. In this very simplified model, patient 0 infects 4 other people, and then those 4 other people infect 8 others, and so on and so forth. The actual numbers would likely be much higher because these individuals are moving around the city, infecting people as they go, instead of staying in this neat configuration. If only confirmed infected people isolate, we're still one step behind the virus, since infected people are contagious before showing any symptoms. With digital contact tracing, when someone finds out that they're infected, they and their proximity contacts immediately self-isolate without any manual tracing lag. So those are the basics of digital contact tracing, and that brings us into why we created this report. It started off as a client project for a contact tracing app focused on the employer use case. And by employer use case, we mean the client was looking for a solution for employers to facilitate and manage bringing people back to work safely. In doing this project, we accumulated all this research and knowledge that we felt would be helpful to others, especially to the design community, people designing contact tracing technologies, as well as leaders in government and healthcare. We learned about how contact tracing apps work, the technology, requirements, and constraints, what products are out there today, and what products are being built right now, current processes like manual tracing and how contact tracing fits in, and then attitudes towards location tracking and data privacy, to name a few. We thought it'd be important to make this core research accessible to others in the community. However, looking back, we questioned whether this regurgitation of information was actually moving the needle, especially since information was changing weekly and sometimes daily. We wanted to be proactive and orient our report around modeling the problem space and recommendations instead of just recapping all of our research. So we thought, what value can we add on top of all of this as designers? And here is an overview of our presentation agenda. We're going to present some highlights from our core research, then walk through some of our early models in the problem space, talk about the adoption challenge with contact tracing apps, go through our ideation exercises, and then finish off with some of the challenges we encountered. So first of all, I'll be recapping some highlights from our core research. So we wanted to understand the fundamentals of this topic before modeling the problem space. Inspiration was another part of the research. The core research served as the building blocks and inputs to complete our early modeling and ideation exercises. So we reviewed existing contact tracing apps to identify key flows and features. These existing and developing contact tracing apps included Apple's COVID-19 app, the Public Health Authority apps, foreign apps, and regional US apps. Something interesting here to point out is the Corona 100M South Korean app. It tracks infected individuals and all their movements, and something like that would probably not fly in the US. And instead, in these US apps, there's more focus on like social distancing and symptom tracking, high-level regional insights about infection spread, and even preparing for manual contact tracing interview. We did daily news pulses every morning to stay up to date with the latest contact tracing news. We dealt with constantly changing constraints, and we had to be adaptive to those constraints. Google and Apple have been making headlines daily with their collaboration on what they describe as an exposure notification API. Instead of calling it contact tracing, they call it exposure notification. And going back to our point on constantly changing constraints, one example of a changed constraint that occurred in the middle of developing our report was that Google and Apple announced that they would ban location tracking and only limit one contact tracing app per country. So what conditions must be met in order for a contact tracing solution to be successful? First of all, high adoption rates. The app needs to be highly adopted in order for digital contact tracing to be effective. Outbreak density and regional readiness. Contact tracing is the most effective in regions with fewer cases or when people are re-entering society. So a phase we're in right now, if shelter in place were to be mandated in a city, this app would not be as effective. Enabled permissions at time of contact. So core permissions like Bluetooth must be on, enabled and functioning correctly when two users cross paths. Voluntary self-reporting. The infected user must report positive test results in the app in order to notify potentially exposed users. Access to testing and fast turnaround. A user with suspected infection should have immediate access to COVID testing with rapid turnaround times for results, as well as sound policy and swift leadership. So tech is only one part of an effective strategy. New technology needs to be complemented by sound policy and swift leadership. And that ties up some of our highlights from our core research. And now I'm going to pass it on to Sarah to talk about some of our early modeling of the problem space.
Cool. Bear with us as we switch over. This is just a constraint of being remote. Okay, so after we had done all this initial research, we just had learned so much information, and we turned to models as a way to help us digest that information. So models are a tool that we often use at DesignMap in our client projects as well. And the idea of them is not to replicate the problem or represent everything 100% accurately. Instead, what we're trying to do is tease through nuances of the information and the problem space and understand relationships. So the goal when we were working on this project specifically was for Vivian and I to clarify our thoughts, like I said, explore relationships, and especially in this shelter-in-place time when we're working remotely, we needed to do these models as a way to make sure Vivian and I were on the same page for that collaborative aspect. So one of the first models we started out with, and this is actually in the report too, in one of the earlier sections, is we looked to Stuart Brand's PACE layer framework as a piece of inspiration for us. So the idea behind this model is that society has many layers and every layer has a specific purpose. So nature is one of the innermost layers, and on the outside is technology with different, some additional levels in between. And the idea is that nature, being the innermost layer, is one of the slowest layers, and it's supposed to be stabilizing and just slow paced, whereas the outermost layers are fast moving, and this is where innovation happens. So this model, we felt, allowed us to take a step back and understand and explain why coronavirus and everything going on right now that we're all experiencing has created so much societal trauma for everybody in like all aspects of our lives. So coronavirus, you know, should be a part of nature as a virus, but what we all saw is that it was very contagious and fast moving and deadly, and so the pace of the virus did not match the layer that it was supposed to. And as a result of that shift, it just created all this trauma across the other layers. So we saw that, you know, being forced to shelter in place was difficult. Governments didn't really have the right response immediately, and there wasn't infrastructure for testing and so on and so forth. So with technology being the outermost layer, again, that's why digital tracing seemed like one of the most viable solutions for responding to the virus. So after looking at this inspiration model, we started turning inward to create some models of our own. And we started out with a 10,000 foot view. And what I'm about to show you is not the most beautiful models, but these are actually just internal tools that we use to help us understand the problem space. So this first model is a concept map, and we borrowed from Hugh Debberley's method to create this model. And the goal of this one was to put everything down in one holistic view. So the way we went about this is we used nouns and verbs being the connections between the nouns. Like I said, it's very ugly, but the purpose of it is to capture everything in one view. And what we tried to do here is highlight the stakeholders, so everybody that was involved in this whole contact tracing conversation, including Apple and Google, public health authorities, the users who you know, get infected and have to go get tested and report their results. And another layer to this is the technology layer. So as Vivian mentioned, there's a lot of considerations and a lot of things that need to be in place for digital contact tracing to be successful. So we tried to include those details here, including like the Bluetooth beaconing. We learned that there's a lot of, you know, for a Bluetooth beacon, there's considerations like signal strength, duration, and when it happened to. So capturing that here as well. Testing, of course, as we've all come to understand, is an important part of making sure that people get tested so they know if they have the virus so they can input it into the apps. And some other key interactions between these different entities. So after this model, we felt like we weren't ready to solution just yet. So we ended up, you know, narrowing our focus a little bit more and instead creating a 1,000-foot view. So this model is even ugly. In this model, we use to map the flow of information from the time someone understands that they're infected with the virus to when they input it into their app. So this was something that we felt we really needed to understand in order to wrap our heads around the space. And this did get us one step closer in terms of understanding the problem space. But we had another model here narrowing even further to a 100-foot view to focus more on the people and the infected patients. So we did a bit of mapping to understand the health status, and this is where we started to take into account asymptomatic people and symptomatic people, and how time plays a factor in when they cross and the spread of infection. So this model in itself allowed us to add on these different questions, and these questions are how Vivian and I confirmed for ourselves that we were looking at the right areas and that we understood all the right pieces that were related to. Okay, we have one more switch with transition. Oh, I think you're on mute, Vivian.
Hello, sorry. So I'll be talking about the adoption challenge around contact tracing apps. In the digital contact ecosystem, there are 50 plus projects in progress. These different stakeholders, including tech companies, academic institutions, public health authorities, are all developing their own guidelines and running their own projects. So there's a lot of fragmentation going on of apps that have similar functionality and features. However, Apple and Google plan to address this fragmentation by limiting the use of their tech to one public health authority app per country. Americans continue to be skeptical of contact tracing technologies. So to the right, we have a survey of the level of support and methods like temperature checks, thermal cameras, contact tracing apps, and the level of support people feel about each of these methods. And people on average rated contact tracing apps 40 out of 100, with 100 being the most supportive. Therefore, the majority of people are not okay with digital contact tracing because they feel like it infringes on their privacy and security. Security infringements by tech companies in the past have also made people lose their trust. Going back to the critical adoption rate, 60% of people would have to download and use the app to make it work effectively. Epidemiologists use this scenario modeling to land at these percentages. Adoption rates in other countries isn't so encouraging. There was around a 20% adoption for Singapore's Trace Together app and about an 8% adoption for Australia's COVID Safe app. And this was around early May. Oops. So 60% of the population also means roughly 80% of all smartphone users need to install and use these apps. And just to, for comparison, what are the applications that we know well today that have 60% adoption rate in the US or higher? So in 2019, YouTube reached a 73% adoption rate for all US adults, and Facebook reached 69% adoption rate across all US adults. And another example, WhatsApp took 11 years to get to 60% plus adoption rate in its best markets around the world. So that leads us to asking, what practical solutions could allow us to achieve the critical level of contact tracing adoption? And now I will pass it on to Sarah to talk about some of our ideation exercises.
Cool. So this was actually the bulk of our report, and we wanted to nerd out with you guys a little bit on our process here and share with you how we approached everything. So after doing the research, after doing the models, and then narrowing our focus and deciding that we wanted to focus on adoption specifically, we kind of let our questions guide our process in this way. So we would start with one question, and after we answer that, that would lead to another question, and so on and so forth. And we really let the content guide us through. One of the ways we started was thinking about the angles that matter to different stakeholders. It felt like there were just so many different ways of looking at this problem. So we wanted to just map out the angles that matter, and then what are the opposing views on both of those sides. From there, we kind of started thinking about, well, what is actually the thing we're trying to achieve here? And that is, we wanted people to actively participate in contact tracing apps. And in order to do that, we knew that we needed to design in a way that affected people's behaviors and caused them to change. And there's a lot of ways to do that, we believe, but for this report, we focused on incentives. And so looking at incentives, we did some research and we started to think about how can we categorize different types of incentives. And so we ended up structuring them as positive and negative. And then we also understood that there's an extrinsic and intrinsic angle to this as well. Extrinsic meaning from outside of you, and intrinsic from your own motivation. So there were just a lot of ways to slice and dice this, but we learned that positive incentives tend to be more successful, and this sent us down a line of psychology research actually, and we learned that positive incentives are more effective because the human brain is just more receptive to positive feedback, and oppositely, fear and anxiety and those emotions tend to actually make people withdraw, which is the opposite of what we wanted to achieve. And so from here, focusing on positive incentives, then we started to think about, well, what are examples of positive incentives in the products and experiences that we use and interact with in our day-to-day lives. So these are some of the ones we found. There's some like social media platforms leverage social pressure and popularity, like likes or hearts on Instagram, to drive people to act. There's ones like free stuff. I think everybody loves free stuff, and that's always a driver of motivation. There's some, actually, this is a good one to call out, the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge a few years ago. That one's not really a digital experience, but there's an idea of participating in this viral activity for the greater good or for a good cause. So after we pulled these examples and inspiration, we felt like we needed to contextualize them in the scenarios that people would be in as they started re-entering society. So all of us right now, kind of during this time, actually going back to work, starting to go out to restaurants, going to the store, these situations grounded our ideas so that we made sure that we were designing practical solutions for real people in the real world in soon to be real situations. The ideas themselves we left out of this presentation just for the sake of time, but they're included in the report. But in terms of the ideation process, Vivian and I spent a lot of time sitting on Zoom together. Usually we would be whiteboarding in the same room at our studio, but we just collaborated over Zoom to toss ideas back and forth. And Vivian would have an idea, then I would build on that, and then it would change. And it was a very collaborative, high touch and organic process too, to create these ideas. So after we created a list of the ideas, we felt like it was meaningless just in a flat list like this. So we needed a way to strategically compare and evaluate them. So we actually turned to the 2x2 matrix as a tool for helping us do that. But a problem we ran into was deciding what the axes of the 2x2 should be. So when we got stuck here, we actually revisited this list of angles that we started out this ideation process with. And looking across them, we pulled out privacy and adoption as the two most important angles that we cared about at this point in time. Privacy, because that's been at the crux of this whole contact tracing discussion since the beginning. I think that's what Americans are really worried about. And adoption, because there's a need to hit that 60% critical mass number. So after pulling those two out, we plotted them on the matrix. Privacy is the Y, adoption is X. And after that, we were able to plot our ideas. So in order to identify where on the matrix to put it, we just relied on our intuition and also some lightweight desk research. So probably like how accurate the placement of these are, the points that is, would need some more in-depth research or some statistics to understand nuances of like policy or certain decisions. But for the sake of time, we needed to move fast, and this is how we placed them. And so after plotting them, we divided the matrix up into these categories to help us start to think about the most successful to maybe less successful ideas. And we came to the conclusion that maybe adoption would definitely need to be high for an idea to be successful, but also that we thought ideas where people were more anonymous in their identity and privacy was more prioritized would be more successful in the US, specifically given American attitudes about being traced and being surveillanced. So after this, we just tried to identify patterns in points that were located in proximity on the matrix. So we came to understand that some ideas had this very strong social aspect, almost like social media platforms, and leveraging peer pressure, and those elements might drive people to adopt contact tracing apps. Another angle we uncovered was around leveraging people's routines. So in order to impact behavioral change, we thought that maybe attaching new actions onto people's existing routines might help them adopt those behaviors sooner and more successfully. Another one is free stuff. Everybody likes free stuff. So we're thinking about how could local businesses and restaurants and the community or other stakeholders start to become more involved and offer incentives that people would actually care about, even if they're on a small scale, for example, like a free dessert with a restaurant check-in. And this one is a bit of an anomaly, but we think it's important to mention too, the idea of trust in personal networks. We found that people are more inclined to do something if people in their network are also doing it too. So that was an idea that we played around with as well. So that was kind of what we included in the report, and we have some thoughts to share with you around it too, thinking now with our perspective 2020. In putting together this report, we just felt like the whole time we were racing against the clock, not only because of the speed of transmission of coronavirus, but as Vivian mentioned, every single day it seemed like there was an update that created either a new design constraint or changed an existing constraint that we were working with. So that's why we felt we were working so fast to put out the report in 1 week. And then also just American attitudes about digital contact tracing was a big barrier, and the whole reason why this report actually even existed, because in some more countries with more authoritarian style governments, they're able to mandate this type of surveillance that isn't possible here in the US. In terms of what's next, we really only solved like the tip of the iceberg of this problem. We understand there's so many more angles and design problems to solve. Like we said, even deciding to focus on a specific type of incentive led us down this path, but there are likely so many other ways to approach this problem. A second thing we wanted to mention is that before this presentation, we did another news pulse, and it seems like American attitudes about contact tracing are even lower than when we were working on this report too, and they're continuing to decline. So it seems like the success of digital contact tracing in the US is very questionable, and there's just a lot of considerations, and it feels like maybe the circumstances are not set up in a way to facilitate them being used by everybody at the adoption rate needed right now. So with that, that kind of wraps up our presentation, and we wanted to open it up for questions or thoughts on this topic.
Awesome, that was a really great and thorough talk. I mean, I read this report before, but it's definitely still very enjoyable to listen to you guys talk through their process. I guess one question I have is, like you said, the privacy is definitely a big problem in America. Like, people are afraid of being surveilled, and like when you're designing this app and when you're looking at other people's like other contact tracing app as it's growing every day, like a lot of countries and private companies are developing this. Like, do you see a solution that you find like you're impressed by in any aspect? You can feel free to like elaborate on those.
Yeah, so actually this was a part of some of our initial, we looked into that when we were doing some initial research for our client project a while back. And there's a few other alternatives to this. And one is the QR codes, which I believe Korea and China are using right now. So before you go into a public location, you scan a QR code that's posted on the outside. And that is more effective when it's mandated. But that's another problem in the US. There's not really an infrastructure set up to support that right now. And I think QR codes aren't really used here like they are in China, for example. Another one was just like mandated government surveillance of your location and your health. So in Korea, there's like a database where you can go online and view all of the information for infected patients in your neighborhood and other areas too. And it just, I think, leaves out their name, but there's enough information that it identifies them basically. So that of course wouldn't work here as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot of constraints due to our culture here that prevent some of those more authoritarian methods from being successful. So digital contact tracing with manual contact tracing for now seems to be one of the better solutions.
Yep. Yeah. And then in doing my,
sorry, go ahead.
In doing my landscape review of all the applications that are in the US, a lot of them don't try to tackle the location and Bluetooth. They try to tackle other things that they find helpful, like social distancing or tracking your symptoms, or how to prepare for a manual contact tracing interview. So working around the security and privacy concerns and kind of tackling these other areas that they find helpful.
Yeah. And I wonder like, have you guys talked to any contact tracers, like people like who are tracing manually?
We have
no,
not.
We haven't. That would be a great addition to this report, though, to get their yeah.
Yeah, because I haven't really like read too much about how they actually tracing people manually, but that would be something I think will be like very interesting like to look in, because we see like contact tracing on the news all the time, but I think it would be like interesting to like hear their stories at the same time. Yeah, and I think what you said like about the culture, like American culture is different. I think designing this, like it's sort of like make us be able to see how big those differences are, like cross country and cross culture. So I think that's also something like interesting for us to think about.
Yeah,
definitely.
In regards to the Apple and Google API, I just did a really quick news pulse this morning. So it's not really making its way in the US, but Finland and Ireland and Portugal are all adopting it. And Singapore, Australia are also using the Google and Apple API, even though I believe it was developed for like the US, mainly the US contact tracing apps, but other countries are adopting it, but not the US, because I'm sure the attitudes towards it. So just a little news pulse I did this morning.
Yeah. I'm curious, like for everyone who's still staying, like I'm kind of curious to do a quick poll, like how many people are actually okay with like sharing their data, or like doing be able to adopt a contact tracing tool like on themselves. Like if you are willing to, and if you're comfortable with it, you can type in 1 in the chat. And if you are not comfortable, feel free to type in 2. Wow, that's wow. I say uno and 1.5.
I think something that this is part of the report too. We didn't include it in this presentation, presentation, but the data that the public health authorities are actually wanting from people is way less than the data that many people already share to Google for free right now. So Vivian showed me on her phone that like the Google, is it Google Maps, I think, or was it a different app?
Yeah, I'm not sure what app it is, but basically I get a report every month telling me exactly what locations I've been to, exactly how much time I spend at each of those locations, what pictures I took at each of those locations, and it gives me this report. And then obviously my report for May and April are not very extensive because I stayed at home all the time, but it would give me very detailed information around my location whereabouts, and it was really creepy. But yeah, I didn't know Google was already collecting that information without my knowing. So things like that.
Yeah, it sounds super creepy. It's like you know, like they are collecting your data. They just all of a sudden, out of nowhere. That's pretty creepy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really definitely interesting things. And I'm actually, and going back to the poll, because I'm looking at the poll right now, and I think out of my surprise, I think a lot of people select one, and so I'm actually I wouldn't mind like if people want to talk more about this and sharing like why. I love to like after the talks, I love to like stay and like talk to you guys, why, and we can have a discussion afterwards. And also most importantly, we're gonna have the raffle after all the talks, so please stay until the raffle happens. Without further ado, and thank you, Vivian and Sarah, for the talk. This is really great. I've been looking forward since the time like we started talking, so I appreciate it. And we're gonna move forward to our second talk. So for our second talk is going to be given by Ben. Ben is a director at Stanford Healthcare Innovation Lab, and he led a team of scientists, designers, like on working on a research study using wearable devices to predict and prevent infectious diseases. And I actually happen to on Ben's team. So as he's talking, I'm going to jump in and talk a bit about the things we are working on. So let's give the screen to Ben and let him talk about what he's been working on.
Great, excellent. I timed this very poorly in the sense that I was just getting some coffee right now. But let me, give me about 60 seconds before fully jumping in as I pull up this presentation. So very first of all, Kashin, this is absolutely amazing. You've done an incredible job putting this group together, and that last presentation just was completely mind-blowing. You guys really very, very, very impressive work. All right. And then also as this goes on, as far as the format goes, Kashin, you want all questions at the end?
Yeah, so by the end, we're gonna have a Q&A after we talk through everything.
Okay, great, great.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let me just pull this up. Okay, give me one more minute, guys.
Sounds good.
I think Sarah and Vivian might have to jump off in a little bit if we want to revisit some of the questions that folks might have asked earlier in the chat. That'll also buy some time. What do you think, Keshin?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, great. So we're going to go through Q&A for the last group. I'm ready now, but I think that actually could be a good idea either way, especially if they need to go.
Yeah, actually, sorry, Sam, are you saying the Q&A or the raffle?
I can read off the questions really quickly and keep it short. I'll skip through mine, but Beth had the question, really like the clarity in how you're presenting your research. Visuals communicated really well. Is this how you presented it to the stakeholders, or do you usually tailor it differently for who you're actually speaking to?
This presentation we created just for this meetup, but we usually, I think the pattern of presentation or method, I guess you could say, is something we try to do in our client presentations, like providing the context and like the math behind the thinking. I think as consultants, that's like almost as big of a part of our role as the design work. So yes, does that answer that question?
I think so. And then there was another question from Leonard. The concept map is super intriguing. How did it inform your work, and would you use it again?
Yeah, definitely would use it again. And sometimes I feel like what we learn and the output of it isn't very tangible or like explicit. So I think that concept map we just needed to do in order to get us to that process model, in order to get us to the next one too. So it's kind of just like a stepping stone tool. Sometimes in some of our client projects, a concept map like that ends up becoming like more of a final deliverable. But it kind of depends on the situation and the problem we're looking at too. But for this project, all of those models we didn't include in the report. So we felt like it was a little bit too deep, but given the audience of this group, we thought it might be more interesting and more relevant. So that's why I wanted to bring that back up. But yeah, we just think of it as a tool to get to the next step that we need to do in the process.
Cool. And then the last question here was, how long was the duration of this project? How many people worked on it, and why did DesignMap decide to pursue it?
This was 1 week, this project, this report. Our client project was 1 week as well. So this was like a second week, I guess, on the same topic. But I think with this coronavirus time and just the economy not doing so well, Vivian and I weren't on projects for that 1 week. And so this was an opportunity for us to take everything we had learned. And I think if we hadn't have done this report, it just would have sat in our Figma files and nothing would have been shared really. And we had just learned a lot of information too. So we felt like this was our way that we could contribute, us and DesignMap, to become a part of the coronavirus conversation and start to not only think about retroactively what has happened, but be more proactive and future facing and solutions oriented too. And I think that's been a gap in everything we've been seeing too, the focus on practical solutions. So we felt like that was where we wanted to invest our time.
Yeah, that's really great. That's really great answers. And thank you guys so much for giving us this talk again today. And please keep in touch. I know you guys are in San Francisco, so but I think there will be opportunities where we can continue a conversation together.
Definitely. Thank you guys so much for hosting us, for everybody for being engaged. This is awesome.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having us. It was awesome.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye.